He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai, and welcome to RNZ100, a century of stories. If you love history, inspiring and quirky characters, or a good old ponder about what makes us uniquely Kiwi, then this is the podcast for you. Yes, RNZ has been connecting New Zealanders and telling our stories for 100 years. So we've dug through the archive and picked out a whole heap of the best bits, the events and people that have shaped us, and the crazy, funny tales that have been forgotten until now. In fact, we've dug so deep that some of the audio you're about to hear hasn't been heard since it was first broadcast decades ago.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
And now for the Devil's Playground.
It was a beautiful land, a thriving community.
We'd produce a nation of gigolos.
This is Jazzercise.
Crowd refusing to go, chanting, we want rugby.
What this bill about is abnormal sex between males.
We wouldn't have known a sexual orgy if we'd fallen over one.
New Zealand is brimful of interest.
I'm Mike McRoberts, and 40 years ago I started my journalism career as a cadet at RNZ. Now I'm back to celebrate 100 years of RNZ's broadcasting history. Over those 100 years, RNZ has reflected and connected New Zealanders, and this series will highlight just how wide and impactful RNZ's presence has been. This episode is Rebellion and Innovation, and we want to start this series with the important rebels and upstarts who came at problems from a different perspective. Visionaries who innovated in their rebellion and ended up changing our perspective, our outlook, and our country forever. So who better to join us than one of New Zealand's greatest ever broadcasters? She's grilled countless politicians as well as our finest thinkers, artists and innovators. She's a 38-year stalwart of RNZ. It's Kim Hill. Kia ora, Kim.
Lord, stalwart.
Stalwart.
I'm not sure I like the sound of that.
We're off to a great start.
Yeah.
Also joining us is historian and member of the New Zealand Order of Merit, no less, Peter Lynham.
Now, he's a stalwart.
Stalwart.
Possibly.
A stalwart.
Stalwart. All right, straight into it. We start with someone who personifies innovative rebellion in Aotearoa. Someone who, through their peaceful protest, inspired a movement that continues to reverberate throughout the country today.
Children, I've made this opportunity for you. I want you, now remember, to have that pride of race.
That was the legendary activist Dame Whina Cooper addressing the rangatahi who joined forces with her in 1975 on Aotearoa's most famous hikoi. The walking protest against the continuing loss of Māori land started with just 50 marches in the Northland settlement of Te Hapua. Numbers grew as the group, Te Ropu Matakiti or Aotearoa, traversed more than 1,000 kilometres over 30 days. By the time the hikoi reached Parliament, they numbered 5,000. The march became a national event broadcast across the country, and Dame Whina Cooper, nearly 80 years old at the time, became an enduring figure of determination, eloquence and mana.
Talk about stalwart. She was extraordinary. I just think of that glorious photograph of her.
Mm-hmm. The one where she's holding hands with the mukapuna and she's got the scarf on.
Yeah.
And remember that, she came from a very poor Māori community in the north, a small Catholic community that had a vision, and she had managed to create a coherent vision that would take Māori to new places in the face of westernisation and exclusion. She was able to see a different vision of the future, which proved to be so prophetic.
Well, let's take a listen to her now.
We want all the statutes, all the laws that are pertaining to take our land, little by little at a time, to be wiped right off, and let us retain the 2 million, only 2 million that is left out of 66 million.
Do you really think the Pākehā is going to listen?
Good gracious, is our land. 2 million is our own land that we are asking.
I know that you've lost a lot of that land, and do you think the Pākehā is going to start listening now?
Of course they will. Of course they will. I have every hope that the Pākehās would.
Why will they listen?
Of course, they're conscious.
Oh, yeah, their conscience.
Yeah.
And doesn't she sound amazing? At age 80 for a start, having just walked, all that distance. And before then, hikoi meant walk, She changed the Māori meaning of the word hikoi.
Oh, did she?
I think so. Yeah, it was just a word. It was a word for walk. No one walked from one end of the country to the other. That was,
There's an interesting story to this of her confidence in her cause.
Yeah.
And
of course, we only have to make it clear what we've lost, and they will recognise the terrible thing, and they will make it right.
Alas, she was mistaken in that, and yet that confidence in the end was to change things, I think, as well as mobilising Māori to have a sense of grievance and a protest. So many Māori had just been enculturated to think that this was the way it was. You just had to lean and bow down.
Well, there were further protests, and one led in Raglan by activist Eva Rickard made our uncomfortable history even harder to ignore.
It was a beautiful land, a thriving community. I was the 8th child in a family of 15. Lived in the beautiful world of the Māori, where we ate white bait like porridge. And there weren't any money. And it was a whole thriving community. We had a big marae, miri at the kakara. It was about 100 feet long. And we had a dining hall and a kitchen.
This was on the prison golf course?
This was on the prison golf course. There was a thriving community.
The government had claimed Rickard's ancestral land beside Raglan Harbour to use as a military airbase during the Second World War, but once peacetime came, instead of handing the land back to Tainui Āwhiro, it was converted to a golf course, including the Urupā. Rickard and other tangata whenua were gathered to hold a ceremonial process in 1978. But before it could even begin, police swarmed in.
When I was arrested, I became very, very bitter, because I had grown up in Raglan, and the race relations here deteriorated overnight. And I was blamed for that. But when I was hauled into prison, 3 prisons in one day, I thought to myself, how can young Māori with no education even stand up to that sort of intimidation? Because let's face it, they tried to intimidate us, to lose our cool. We didn't, we sang.
I'm Māori Pākehā mix. My father was Māori, my mum's Pākehā. I remember her father, my grandfather, just outraged that this would happen.
Your Pākehā grandfather?
Yes, yeah. On a golf course.
Oh, I see, outraged at the protest.
Yes.
The sacred space had been invaded.
Sacrilege.
I think it's interesting that heightening of protest from the 50s through to the 80s actually is one form of innovation versus another. This devotion of Pākehā towards modernisation and creating an innovative society which would be economically prosperous at the price of tradition, at the price of Māori. I think there's a very real need for us still to keep reflecting on the risk when we put one against another.
It was a pretty clear case, though, wasn't it? You would have thought most New Zealanders would have appealed to their sense of decency and justice that this would be returned.
And also, I mean, you referred to the Māori coming back from fighting in the war. This was a classic case. They came back to find that their Turangawaewa had gone, either to a golf course or to an airbase, and was not coming back anytime soon. So they were treated incredibly disrespectfully and just went off elsewhere. It led to fragmentation, dislocation.
I remember for my father, who, as I mentioned, is Māori. So he was one of those Māori who went from rural New Zealand. So he was from Wairoa and went on the Māori Affairs Trade Training Scheme in the 60s. And they took a whole lot of Māori boys out of rural areas and put them into cities. He went down to Christchurch, which was basically going to another country. And And just his reaction to some of these protests and activists, because everyone he worked with was Pākehā, his bosses were Pākehā, and he was embarrassed. You know,
he was troubled.
He was totally over it. You know, like he just thought, you call them shit stirrers.
You know, it's an interesting thing that I grew up as a South Islander on these myths of the best race relations in the world. And I can recall going overseas to do my PhD and then hearing reports of Bastion Point. And I just couldn't understand what was going on. It seemed like a world that I knew nothing at all about. I could hardly interpret the society. But, you know, it took me a long time to recognise that there has to be space given to the angry voices, and to endlessly go for the moderate will actually mean nothing will change for the better.
Which is a perfect way to get into our next subject. Māori haven't just had to fight for their land, but also the right to speak and hear their own language.
At the moment, I think that the amount of time which the NCBC gives to Māori language is totally inadequate and reflects, in fact, their attitude towards any other language other than English. I think just 1 hour coverage of Māori language a week is inadequate. In fact, I think it's almost a national disgrace.
That was Rangi Nicholson from Ngā Tamatoa, a group of young Māori activists who really shook things up in the 70s. Ngā Tamatoa fought for the return of Māori land, Māori representation in Parliament, honouring Te Tiriti, but they're most famous for igniting the revival of te reo in schools, starting with a 30,000-strong petition presented to Parliament.
We are applying political pressure, and through the political pressure we are getting the public aware, we're making the politicians aware.
Isn't there a possibility that by concentrating on the Maori language that you could be papering over other cracks in society, because surely it's the desire of the community as a whole which must bring this to the surface if it's going to come here. We can't legislate for culture, if you like.
Well, I think that we've got to make true the myth that many New Zealanders mouth, that we have the best race relations in the world. So why should we in fact have to petition for our language to be taught and spoken?
Well, that was Ngā Tamatoa leader Hana Te Hemara, who handed over the petition herself on the 14th of September 1972. It was an immediate success, leading the government to introduce optional te reo classes in primary and secondary schools, as well as a 1-year course to train fluent te reo Māori speakers in teaching. Now, my dad was one of the ones who got strapped at school for speaking Māori, and so we never learnt it as children. And, you know, his thought there was pretty simple. Why would I put my own kids through that?
So you've rediscovered your te reo and your whānau, I imagine. Was your father alive to see you start that journey?
Yes, he still is. And
how does he feel about it?
He's kind of curious that myself and my brothers and my my children and their cousins are kind of trying to regain or recapture the language or just learn it. But he understands it. I think he says he's too old now to try and go back there. And you're like, well, so we lost a generation of kaumātua for a start. But it was really...
So does your father have regret about presiding over the lapsing of the culture for that generation?
I think he does. I've never hung that on him though, and nor would anyone. We like anyone of my generation and probably the generations behind
completely
me.
Understandable, but
just know that they were trying to do the best for us.
Of course,
and they've been encouraging, supportive of us following this, but. It's different for them. For us, it's a necessity.
It's an interesting thing that the scholars back in the 1970s said it was impossible to revive a language when the base grew too small. And as far as they were concerned, the base of Māori speaking in New Zealand was just too small to make possible the recovery of the language. And certainly I can recall going to Marae in the 80s, where quite a number of the Māori speaking on the Pai would speak a tiny sentence or two in te reo and then move on to English.
Are you confident that it has revived and will continue to revive. If revival can be a continuous process.
I think so. I think the cork's out of the bottle. Funnily enough, or ironically, some of the efforts to push back on Māori language has only strengthened the resolve for those learning to keep learning. And I just also think, with our younger generations, they're learning te reo Māori at school. Every kid knows their pepe ha these days, which I think, whether they're Māori or not, is fantastic. It's such a great concept to have, and so more accepting of who we are as a nation.
Well, nationhood has been clearly redefined. So, in the 1920s and 30s, when Radio New Zealand was emerging, there was a cultural renaissance, but it was a cultural renaissance effectively of European New Zealand culture, Kiwi, if you like. And we've gone from Kiwi to te reo. And that's a very interesting shift.
The fight was far from over, though. More than a decade later, Māori was still being discouraged from using even the most basic phrases in the workplace. Before she was a dame, a politician and a community leader, Ngā Glavich, then Ngā Povi, nearly lost her job over one simple greeting.
An Auckland toll operator uses kia ora to greet callers, but the post office says it goes against official policy and the woman's been reprimanded. Carol Greensmith reports.
The post office says the official reply of toll operators should be "tolls here," with no greeting at all, and the reason is to save time because toll operators are busy people. However, that doesn't appear to be what happens in practice. A check revealed that 9 out of 10 operators say good morning, good afternoon, evening or whatever, words which have a lot more syllables than kia ora. When I suggested to a toll operator that she was wasting time by saying good afternoon, she argued the point and said it was the style she just learnt at a training seminar. And other toll staff I spoke to told me they thought the simple "tolls here" was too blunt. Ngā Povi, who's at the centre of the issue, says there doesn't seem to be any problem with toll operators who say good morning, only with her kia ora, and she's at a loss to know why.
I find it very hard to understand why I should have to defend a salutation of this country to fellow New Zealanders, to fellow countrymen. I have nothing against good morning or good day or hello. Kia ora is me, part of me.
No, clearly not sensing the PR crisis on his hands, the then Postmaster General Rob Talbot stuck by the kia ora ban, claiming Ngā Povi was making, quote, a mountain out of a molehill.
No, classic, wasn't it?
Yeah, but the tide of public opinion was with the outspoken toll operator from Kaipara. She was on the front page of the paper. School students were writing letters of support, and the post office was swamped with calls from people wanting to speak to the kia ora lady. Prime Minister Rob Muldoon returned from economic talks overseas and swiftly declared that toll operators could say what they liked as long as they didn't sound Australian.
Isn't that extraordinary, though? 12 years after that language petition, and people in charge could still be so dim.
It's a strange thing that New Zealand race relations, if we need to use that term, should have been so much better than they were, because Māori were a significant proportion of the population, very different from Australia. And yet this characterisation of Māori as lazy and a whole lot of nasty epithets and an absolute dogged refusal to consider that ordinary greetings were acceptable suggests a society...
slippery slope. You know, you let the toll operator say kia ora, and the next thing you'll be handing the golf course back to them.
But something is changing in our culture. Something is emerging, and this is the great innovation of the day, surely, that most Pākehā, increasingly an aged group in our society, are watching their mokopuna beginning to speak te reo. There's a fascinating rediscovery of identity going on in New Zealand. It's an uncomfortable one, but it's happening.
Dame Whina Cooper, Eva Rickard and activists of Ngā Tamatoa and Dame Ngā Glavich were just some of the key figures in what came to be known as the Māori Renaissance. And just as Māori were embracing a cultural revival, Pacifica Kiwis were making their voices heard too.
We do see ourselves as the beginning of a new Polynesian front. We see that a lot of racial problems exist in New Zealand, and we realise that we've been the underdog all the time, and so we see ourselves as a self-defence movement, protecting our own race and protecting the community.
That was Polynesian Panthers leader Wayne Toliafoa speaking to RNZ in 1972. Taking inspiration from the American Black Panther Party, the Polynesian Panthers had formed the year before. They wore the same slick black berets as their American counterparts, but their focus was about liberation through opportunity and education. Founding member Will Ilola here told RNZ Selwyn Muru what the group was all about.
Basically, we've got community programs, food program that gives people cheap food, bus programs to prisons, education centres would teach the youth to use homework classes and the old people to learn English, and we run an office as an information centre. Plus, we try and help the people by attacking the system as much as possible to correct our situation for our people.
Will, where does the system fall down in terms of Polynesian welfare?
Basically, it's not geared for the Polynesian people. That's why we call it a racist system, because it's only geared for the European.
Pretty big callback then to call it a racist system, wasn't it?
But now we know.
Yeah.
I think this remains one of those really treacherous places for New Zealanders. Typically, for example, other Polynesians feel quite uncomfortable at how to relate to Māori. You know, they know that this is the Māori land, and they don't know how to present themselves alongside Māori. And I think it is really quite problematic, because will, in the long run, nationhood in New Zealand embrace the Pacific? You could argue that with climate change, that may in fact be the case. We are the largest, in Auckland, the largest Polynesian city in the world. Making sense of that, and especially creating space for the distinctive customs of Polynesia, is a real challenge.
Well, after spending decades actively recruiting Pacific Islanders to come to New Zealand and fill jobs Kiwis didn't want to do, the government swiftly turned its back on the new immigrants and their families as soon as they became politically inconvenient. In came the dawn raids of the mid to late 70s. And they were just... I remember being, I think, about 10 years old and at a friend's place, and saw one of their neighbours, Samoan man, being chased by police through their backyard. And it was traumatic. It was awful. And you saw this happening to families all over the place.
The point is, and people don't understand this still, they say, well, you know, people are here illegally, and blah, blah, blah. There are many, many people who are here illegally, but they only chase the brown ones.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, they practically ignored British and American overstays. There were just as many of them here, but they made up 5% of the prosecutions. Pacific people at the time made up 86%.
And I think the other factor that's quite significant is that they lived together. They lived in very specific parts of the cities, and their style of living meant an element of community sharing that people found distasteful. I think we have to be honest that there was a great deal of putting down of the Pacific mode of living, which they were simply trying to adjust to cope with the New Zealand climate, New Zealand circumstances.
Again, othering, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, next thing it's they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. It's just difference. And we're still very allergic to certain differences in this country, even though we proclaim ourselves as very tolerant. I mean, I think tolerance is in many cases still indifference and apathy until you have to take a stand, and then you take a stand in the wrong place.
All of this to say, if you were Māori or Pacifica in the 70s and 80s New Zealand, it was a battle just to be treated fairly. And if you happened to be gay, well, it was certainly no picnic either.
When I told my parents that I was homosexual,
father hit the roof, and you can see the hole where he went through even yet. Mother was quite calm about it, but father, to bring up a son who turns out to be a pansy, a queer like he was.
Did your parents ever come to terms with this?
Father has never come to terms with it. He's hardly spoken to me in 20 years.
That was Gary, a gay man, speaking to RNZ's Insight programme under a pseudonym in 1970. Then queer people had very little freedom to publicly be themselves, and homosexuality was spoken about like an illness, something that could be fixed with the right treatment.
Have you ever felt the urge yourself to seek treatment in order that you might cease being a homosexual?
Yes. I went to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist told me that really there was nothing he could really do because apparently whatever emotional attachments that I had towards the male were too fixed anyway for changing. At one stage I went through a religious stage, and I felt so attracted towards the young minister that I was in no better position. I'm sorry.
Do you remember a television documentary in which it was Inglewood, and somebody, after a terrible incident in Inglewood, and I think somebody belonging to the Inglewood Rugby Club was asked whether he would prefer to be thought of as a rapist or queer, and he said a rapist.
Wow.
Unfortunately, for LGBT people in our society, I mean, we've had an enormous amount of anger, but not just anger. I think that they wanted us out of the space. We were somehow polluters of the world. And it's been I still think there's a process of acceptance that is only half done at this stage in our society.
What's the other half?
I think there needs to be a place where we don't care about sexuality, actually.
Yeah, will we ever get there, though?
I don't know.
I mean, the identity politics is getting smaller and smaller, hence the LGBTQ, you know.
Yes.
And we can't slice and dice ourselves forever, can we?
No, I think that's true. And I think that, unfortunately, these are cultural battlefields on an international plane. And so things that happen in the distance quickly become matters on which we choose sides.
Well, in 1985, Labour MP Fran Wild introduced the Homosexual Law Reform Bill. It aimed to decriminalise gay sex for those over 16 and make it illegal to discriminate against gay Kiwis when it came to work, housing and supplying goods and services. It was a massive step forward for the rainbow community, but in Parliament the bill gave rise to a tidal wave of vitriol.
And what this bill about is abnormal sex between males. It's about sodomy. And I'm not going to quote the scriptures like the member for Wellington Central or the member for Palmerston North. All I know is if the good Lord wanted us to procreate the race through the rear, he'd have put the womb down there somewhere. That's all I can say.
My grave concern is that the next step with the militant gay rights movement, if this bill succeeds, will be to press for acknowledgement of so-called gay marriages between consenting adults. I find this absolutely repugnant.
Peter, do you think we handled this as a nation better or worse than others around the world?
Worse, I think, probably.
Why is that?
I think because it threatened the nuclear family. You know, New Zealand was an unusual society in that it had emerged as a European society in the age of the nuclear family, where the couples chose each other on the basis of love and they procreated, and the happy family was very, very powerful as a type in the New Zealand Pākehā society. And so the threat was that great, enormous feeling of challenge, and so a combination of religious and social factors concentrated in and made most gay and lesbian people feel very marginal as a result of that debate.
Well, while politicians were getting all worked up about which private bits go where, queer Kiwis were more concerned with their rights as human beings.
Changes in the Crimes Act decriminalise us. The changes in the Human Rights Commission Act recognise that there is bigotry in the community, and that has certainly been demonstrated by some members of Parliament, and take steps to protect us from that bigotry. That bigotry is what we come across more often than we come across the police. And for that reason, we want to see our rights in terms of jobs, in terms of housing, in terms of loans from banks, protected.
That was John McDavitt from the Gay Task Force speaking to RNZ's Insight programme in 1985. And while the first part of the bill decriminalising gay sex did end up passing, the second part of the bill failed and remained perfectly legal to discriminate against queer people for another 8 years until the Human Rights Act was passed in 1993. When it comes to rainbow issues in politics, the focus is now firmly on transgender Kiwis rather than the gay community. Do you think that?
Yes, I do. I think the issues have moved on and into very difficult ground because there's lots of issues around children and puberty blockers, and we've got also an international context in which British and American opinions are weighing in on the New Zealand context.
So do you see any correlations between how the gay community was spoken about then and now how trans New Zealanders are spoken about?
Very definitely, except that it's a much, much smaller group of people. And so they're very, very vulnerable. And I know a number of transgendered people who have felt almost like retreating completely out of sight because of the kinds of things that get said at the moment.
Well, as we've heard, rebellion in Aotearoa has meant challenging expectations and pushing boundaries, and it can be a messy business. In 1967, Presbyterian minister and religious studies professor Lloyd Gehring publicly questioned both the resurrection of Jesus and the immortality of the soul. A practical man of faith, Gehring said that Jesus coming back to life and physically going to heaven was impossible, and that the church's idea of the soul doesn't exist. We die and that's that. These days, such statements would barely make a splash outside of Christian circles, but in 1967, as reported by RNZ, it landed Gehring on a trial for heresy.
The first of the two speakers to lay charges was Mr. R.J. Wardlaw. His formal charges against Principal Gehring were the denial of the supernatural, and therefore of the Christian doctrine of a transcendent creator God, the denial of the Holy Scripture as the revelation of God in written form by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the denial of the deity and of the supernatural power of Christ, the denial that Christ was raised from the dead, leaving the tomb empty, the denial of a life to come. If these charges were approved by the Assembly, they would virtually mean that Professor Gehring was at least deeply in doctrinal error, if not actually heretical. Nor for Mr. Wardlaw could there be extenuating circumstances, as he said,
Principal Gehring is quite intelligent enough to know just what he was doing when he went into public with his views and statements to the press. He chose his own battleground very deliberately to create what can only be considered a public scandal related to the faith and to attempt a revolution in belief.
What do you make of that, Peter? It does sound like he's been presented to The Hague for war crimes, doesn't it?
Yes, and what was interesting too, it was a very public trial. I lived in Christchurch at the time, and I can recall everybody had an opinion on Gehring's views.
What was your opinion, Peter?
At that stage, I was very hostile to Lloyd Gehring. Coming from a very fundamentalist background.
You thought, well, he's just not a Christian, is he?
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
And, later years I came to know Lloyd, and he's still a remarkable man at 100.
Oh, he's charming.
At 106.
Absolutely charming. I talked to him when he was 100 and he was bright as a button and going for it. But nevertheless, I mean, he's a humanist, but I still couldn't put him together with Christianity.
Yes, and I think that, well, there are two aspects to this. Firstly, that New Zealand didn't accept diversity of belief or values.
At all.
No. So it was a very public... He was on trial before the whole of New Zealand, not just in front of the Presbyterian Church.
But wasn't it like saying, you know, I'm a member of the rugby team, but I'm not going to go into the scrum?
Yes.
I mean, there are certain rules attached to Christianity. That's why it's a religion, and he bucked the rules.
Professor Gehring said the public scandal might actually have been just what the church needed, and essentially he was doing them all a favour.
What puzzles me is that we churchmen are always talking about the renewal of the church and the outreach of the church into the community. And at the very point where there are more people talking about theological issues in New Zealand than ever before, we want to hush it all up and return to our peaceful congregational cocoons. I would like to suggest that what my accusers have been pleased to call the peace of the church is more properly called the sleepiness of the church. And we should be thankful to God that it has been disturbed.
So Gehring was defiant, saying he would go down with all flags flying, though that wasn't necessary in the end. The claims of heresy had been made by conservative Presbyterians and were dismissed by the Assembly, which found that no doctrinal error could be proved. Now, Kim, as you mentioned, you chatted with him, you spoke with him, interviewed him back in, I think, 2013. What was he like?
Oh, charming. No, he's lovely. He's just lovely. But as I say, I just can't understand why he stayed with the church. I mean, at the end of that cut that you played last, he said we should be thankful to God that it has been disturbed. I mean, that is having his cake and eating it too, right? Because he's already said that the idea of God was a humanly created concept. One of the most interesting things that he said was, I said, how do we control our hubris if we've created God? Who's going to put us in our place? And he said, oh, you know, we need to pay attention to Jesus Christ and the example of Jesus Christ. And he also said his faith in the human species has increased over time. He said, we're moving towards a global community with less prejudice and more acceptance and less nationalism. Well, I'm sorry, Lloyd, but the tide has turned. So maybe we need to reintroduce God.
You see, I thought his outspokenness might have helped those Christians who were, you know, maybe battling their own questions around faith.
Well, I mean, he's very outspoken about the exclusion of gay and lesbian people from the church and wholeheartedly welcomed their inclusion.
Yes, indeed, and for that we're immensely grateful. But I would simply say that the diversity of opinion on those sorts of issues is pretty broad right across the whole society, and negative voices and positive voices. There's a lot of tensions in New Zealand society that aren't fully resolved.
Well, little did the conservative politicians of the 1980s know that the biggest threat to the presumed sexual innocence of the nation wasn't the gay community. It was something that would come and take over every aspect of modern life, the internet.
Everyone in the world has access to this. There might be some complete and utter nutter somewhere in the States who writes how to make a bomb that can blow up an Oklahoma City building. My kid can actually get that recipe off the internet, can't he?
Yes, they
I mean,
can.
there could be pornography written there. There could be anything. I mean, what's to stop my kid actually getting all the accessing that?
They can. It's a bit like letting your kid loose in the library, isn't it?
Not really.
No, as we now know, letting your kid loose in the library is quite a bit different. Yes. That was from a discussion on RNZ Spectrum program in 1995. He thought he had problems then. Boy.
Who said surfing on the internet is a fad which will decline as the novelty wears off?
Yeah, that was a thing back then too. Then only 1 in 5 Kiwis had ever heard of the internet, and connecting to the other side of the world through a computer was an absolute marvel.
We're just connecting through to Reuters Business Briefing now. You can hear the modem going. We're actually going online to London here. We're going to be directly talking to the computer in London. Right, we're connected through to London now. We'll just search. We're now at a screen that gives us choice of looking at different countries, different industries, so we can now select a country that we want. We'll start looking about the hotel industry in Thailand, because that's a large resort country. You can click on that and you get the full text of that article.
Oh, where's the wonder gone?
Oh, the dial-up noise.
Yes.
Jeez. Yeah, I don't think even then we kind of realised what a huge thing this was going to be.
I think it's difficult to even now begin to assess what it has meant that we are connected for so much of our time. We're so preoccupied. Everywhere you go, heads looking down, looking at small screens.
I nearly ran a woman over yesterday.
Yeah.
You were driving while texting?
No, she was.
She was doing something on the phone and just wandering along, you know. Honestly, it's so dangerous.
But I want to talk a little bit about our psyche as New Zealanders, because for so long we were isolated and we're at the bottom of the world.
Yeah.
And now we're not, you know, because of this connection.
Yes, you're right that this was the nature of New Zealand, that the politics of isolation and the culture of isolation meant that all ideas came in a kind of delayed kind of way.
And now we hear about how we don't matter a damn instantly.
Yeah.
I think the saddest thing is that we've become a very fragmented society, and this comes down to, well, identity politics and social media and institutions like Radio New Zealand, which its raison d'etre was to bring people together, to be the place where people would hear opinions that differed from their own, but maybe they could just listen to them and things might change slowly. But everything is so niche now that you don't have to listen to anything that is remotely not your opinion. And so your opinion is the only thing in the world and the only thing that matters. And I find that very depressing.
Do you feel like we have less New Zealand views expressed because of this globalisation?
Yes, I do think so. I think now the New Zealand voice seems almost marginal to the discourse that we choose to be part of.
Yeah, I think that would be fair to say, because the voices from the United States, for example, are so magnificently bonkers that we can't tear ourselves away.
So do you think with that in mind that there is still a place for RNZ and media organisations, broadcasters like it in the future?
I think this will need to be rediscovered. It'll be in different ways.
Very tactful.
Well, it will be in different ways, because the ways in which we will find our news and find our opinions, it's difficult to know the ways in which there'll be a space for them. But unless we learn to hear our neighbours, unless we know what the community thinks, then we will all end up behind our fences and there will be no New Zealand anymore.
And I think that's a great note on which to wrap things up. Well, from fighting for land, language and labour rights, our acts of rebellion and innovation have been about trying to make life better for everyone who calls Aotearoa home. It hasn't been easy. At the time, Kiwis who challenged the status quo were arrested, like Eva Rickard, or put on trial, like Sir Lloyd Gearing. But their efforts have nudged us towards becoming a fairer and smarter society. Just like those early days of dial-up modems allowed us to connect to new places and people overseas, ultimately, the way forward probably lies in finding what unites us here at home. I've been thrilled to be united today with Kim Hill and Peter Lynham. Tēnā kōrua. Thank you so much for your time.
Ngā mihi.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for listening to RNZ100, a century of stories. If you'd like to see more, then visit our accompanying website for extra stories, pictures, and a whole lot more audio archive that didn't feature in this episode. Check it out at rnz.co.nz/RNZ100. That's 100. And don't forget to follow RNZ100, a century of stories, so you can listen to more episodes. Available wherever you get your favourite podcasts.